Don't worry if you're excited already. I'm hoping to get you even more excited in that case. I'm not assuming that you have prior experience much prior experience with test automation. We'll cover the basics of this also to get you going. Here is the plan of records. As Raj was just sharing, my name is Frank Dell. I've been with Microsoft almost 20 years now, during which I have been working all the time in the R&D of the F&O application. Prior to that, obviously, Acceptor, and initially in the application space within the supply chain applications, but most recently moved into the platform. My current roles are I'm product manager for the RSAT product. I'm also leading up on extensibility and also compatibility. So there's a couple of other areas I'm involved with as well. But focus here is obviously test automation. So with that, I'll directly jump in and ask the question, so why test automation in the first place? Well, as you all know, the application, the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations app, is running under one version, and that means having your business solution running as a service, and we have these continuous updates that are coming out from Microsoft. We release about 8 times yearly. And add to that then also the updates you are seeing from ISV solutions, quality updates, even like adding new features. And it all adds up to quite a bit of change to your environment that you need to account for. Sure enough, you can like pause updates up to 3 consecutive updates, but really you should start target on staying current. So how do you do that? I mean, each one of these updates may require multiple test passes, and it adds up to a whole lot of test passes. So that's something to consider how you manage that. So just to level set on the focus on this particular session here, tests, come in many forms and shapes. And for those of you familiar with the development process, you would be quite likely familiar with development-driven tests like unit tests or component-type tests. They serve a purpose certainly during the development, and also serve in helping detect during development if like there's regressions that occur. But my focus here is really on the UAT type of testing, where customers are taking new updates and need to go through a UAT to assess that the quality remain good and sound before choosing to take the updates into production. So given the nature that we have like quite many updates that are happening and many test passes that needs to be catered for, UAT testing that are done by end users typically are the SMEs in different areas from different departments. And, this can be your Simon within accounting, can be your Susan in order processing, those people working across the organization. And sometimes they are even like having a hard time finding free time from their regular jobs. So being mindful of how we use their time is quite critical as well. The time that goes into this and the number of test passes that needs to happen really make the case for investing in test automation to help manage that challenge. Test automation comes with certain kind of advantages, you would say. It provides for a repeatable and predictable nature of your test passes. By nature of that it's an automation, it makes it doable to stay current because the incremental cost for doing additional test passes is quite low. in particular, if we compare to doing manual test passes where you are using a lot of time across the SMEs that are involved in the testing. So it helps offset that cost by investing in test automation. So when you look at a strategy of getting on board with test automation, really what you should be looking at is a tool that the SMEs can work with directly. So compare that to like tools for test automation that are technically orientated, that require someone that is a bit tech savvy to work with. You know, those tools work well as well. But if you can find a tool where the SMEs can work independently, then you're more agile in working with your tests and not so dependent on, for instance, an IT department to be directly involved. So that lends the question, how do you get going with test automation? I mean, some companies, when they're doing a test passes, they take a group of SMEs, fence into a room for weeks sometimes to cover a long range of different scenarios, testing them. Working with this as test automation kind of means that you need to reflect upon what do I need to go test? So you need to be looking at this somewhat from a structured approach and getting your head around, so what are really all the processes I need to have covered, and what are the variants I need to support as part of my testing? Calls for taking a step back and trying to build inventory of those processes. This is a space where you might benefit from having some kind of a process model that you can lean yourself towards, as getting inspired by what are really some of the processes I need to go test for. And so there's even a BPM model as part of LCS, and I'll briefly mention that earlier on. But having that model for how you are covering different processes, it's helping you then go over each one of these. And what you then need to do is assess each and every process, how important they are to your business, like prioritizing this to criticality. And here you probably want to have some kind of a metric model that you're using here, like P1s, P2s, P3 type of scenarios, so that you can use that as guiding for how you go about doing your testing. So on the question, what to test and what not to test, this is really, really hard. On ideal circumstances, you'd be able to test everything, but that might not be practical. So when you consider what you'll go test and what kind of coverage you want to be having with your testing, obviously think according to the criticality, you know, more focus on the priority 1 types of test and a little bit less on priority 2 and 3 and so forth. Is probably a good basis to scope from. Something to consider as well is that when you are having a lot of different scenarios like process variants you want to be testing, how do you potentially reduce the number of scenarios? Well, do consider if like you have different scenarios that are overlapping, how you can be smarter in doing testing and not repeating the same type of test over and over again. Then it may be preferable instead moving into covering different scenarios that complement instead of repeating your efforts here. Something to consider as well is that sure, you would normally just go test that the system is working, which may lead you to think, you know, I need to be able to do a certain type of task, so positive type of test. But there may be needs for even testing negative tests as well. Like if the system is supposed to block you off of doing certain things, that may be something you want to be testing as well as part of your test coverage here. One thing to consider as well is that, what do you need to, as a customer, to be testing versus what are you assuming that Microsoft or your partners are doing? So basing on the assumption that we from Microsoft and your partners are doing a decent job in testing as well, then that may suggest that you need to make sure you emphasize on at least some of the tests that are quite unique to you. That is not to say that your common scenario, your common P1s, that you shouldn't test those. No, you should. But you should certainly also test on those things that are very unique to you, because there may not be others having that type of focus. So by end of the day, how much do you need to test? It's a personal matter really. It's a matter of, what's your safety net, how much effort I'm throwing into testing. It might not be practical testing everything, so consider the risks involved in that. What makes you comfortable as you are doing this? And all of this is part of like scoping your testing effort. And really, these types of considerations here can be applied to if you do like manual test passes or automated test passes. But obviously, you get more value in automating those tests that you are needing to repeat again and again and again, which quite likely will be your P1s initially, and then you can expand from that as you see value in maintaining test automation. So I mentioned briefly the BPM model. Within the LCS, we have business process models available that can be looked up and referred to, and they may actually provide you with like a good structure to work from, so that you make sure you cover all the inventory of different processes. Included in LCS, there's an APQC model, which is like I believe it's a non-profit organization with representation from many companies across the world that are participating in building up this model here. So it's based on experiences from many companies and actually do provide a pretty good and exhaustive type of representation of different processes as it's seen across different companies, different industries. So that may be a good starting point to lean yourself against as you are working your way through this. So with all that covered, it gives you like an overview of how to go scope for your testing. But how do you then get going on test automation? Well, first of all, you probably need to acknowledge that it might be a new venue to you. If you've been used to just doing manual test passes, then test automation might need a little bit of time getting your head around that. The structured testing this entails, becoming familiar with this, may require a little bit of time becoming on that mindset. So give it time, learn from experience, and I would say start out light. Don't automate too many cases initially. Automate a few, gain experience from recording, become familiar with some of the best practice associated with doing this, run them a couple of times, reflect what's the value you get, how does this compare to running manual test passes, and so from all your awareness and your comfort that you build up there, gradually expand on your coverage and build and automate more test cases as you go. Something to consider is that it may not be everything you would be looking at automating. Like if there's some unique thing you need to go test for, but might not be a P1 or even a P2 type scenario, but still is something new that are getting added to the system, like a new feature or customization you're applying, then that may ask for that you do some testing here. But in that space, you might be just wanting to do manual or ad hoc testing of that, because there are other areas that you would benefit more from having test automation. So make that assessment on whether actually test automation or manual testing apply well in this space here. So Talking about test automation and some of the best practices in this space here. When you're running test automation, obviously you're not having the benefit from interacting as you're executing the test. You're kind of doing that up front as you're recording your test and composing them. So make sure that you eliminate some of the uncertainty in the execution. Run your test from a known data set so that you know that you have a predictable starting point for those tests as they run. And that might mean that you want to be having like a data set you restore prior to executing your test. It may also mean that you want to be resetting usage data that has been made. I know many that are using test automation, the RSAT tool, initially in their test have like a test case that are resetting the usage data to make sure you have that good starting point before running. Another good practice is don't make your test cases with too many steps. They become hard to maintain in that way. Instead, consider that you piece your scenarios up in having more cases that you combine. You can benefit from using variables that can be used to connect one case to another. And so certainly use that as part of this to piece them together, to piece your scenario together. You might also consider that, like, if you have a number of different scenarios you want to be covering, but they have a commonality in terms of, say, they are offsetting from a similar type of document, but then they do something different in the end of the scenario. Okay, in that case, you might have like a test case that are creating that data you want to offset from. And then as you want to be running different types of cases, you know, have first that case that creates the new records, have a variable where you pass on that context to then another case that are picking up and completing that particular scenario. So in this case, rather than you're repeating the same steps with each and every scenario you need to cover, do it once, repurpose that by running this kind of staging case multiple times. If you're finding at some point in time that you need to change your recording for whatever reason, I would say I would probably recommend that you make a new recording rather than editing recordings. Editing recordings can be seen to be complex and error-prone, I must say. And so recording a new recording is probably preferable in some cases, which again speaks for having those recordings that are not too long, you know, makes it more doable also to re-record as opposed to needing to edit. So on the best practices also, make sure you create your test to be resilient to change. This means being mindful of how you are creating your test so that you're not making a lot of dependencies on your data set you're operating on. For instance, in a scenario, if you are recording and you are picking, doing a lookup on a field and picking row number 5 in that one there, you know, what happens if the data set changes and another record is put in the middle, then the test would break. So instead, considering entering values or using filters as part of your recordings to isolate records to make sure you're selecting the records, the data that you are indeed intending for. When you're doing tests, make sure as part of the test that you're testing the outcome, that match what you expect. You know, if you're just recording the steps you go through, then you may be able to play that through. And is that a success? Well, only if there's no errors that are occurring. What if there's a warning? What if the data outcome is different? Then, you know, it is better to check to see if the data, if the outcome is exactly as you're expecting. So do be mindful of including steps that actually confirm this by testing values or messages as part of the process. You are able to, in some scenarios, or need in some scenarios, to provide values that are unique, like a voucher number or something like that. And here you'd see that we have options for within the Excel to use formulas where you can use something like a rand between or now to build up like values that can be used to provide some unique values. One small detail is that specifically for the RSAT tool, when it's running a test on a form, it would automatically expand all forms to make controls available to that. So that's not something you need to be mindful of expanding and colliding tabs. That is done automatically. And with that, I'd want to turn to introducing the RSAT tool. RSAT is short for Regression Suite Automation Tool. This is a tool that we provide for Microsoft. It's a tool that allows for running testing on the user interface directly. It's been designed for end users. You don't need to be able to create code. There's no code involved in this. Basically, what happens is that it's a kind of like a macro recording. The task recorder allows for the user to go through steps within the application that are getting recorded, and these recordings are later included in the RSAT tool and can be played back multiple times. And supported are the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations app, also the Commerce CPOS client, and the Warehouse Mobile client scenarios as well. The RSAT tool provides some capabilities, as mentioned before, to be able to evaluate if the outcome of the scenario has been passing by validating field values as expected, or if there's messages that occur like as part of the execution. You're able to also, after you've recorded your test, to change parameters in the test subsequently within the RSAT tool. So like if you are having a similar set of steps, but you want to be testing with some different data, then you can basically make changes to that directly in RSAT in a parameter file. And I'll show you that in just a moment. So the general idea is you can record a case once, and you could do playback multiple times across different data, different legal entities, and repurpose the test in that sense. Playback, furthermore, is such that it's running under a particular security role. You can use a set of test users you have pre-configured that you then can say, this particular case I want to be running under a user that is like a sales order processor. And so making sure that with the limited security that provide that you are in fact able to complete your scenario. So I mentioned earlier on that you might benefit from the business process modeler. This is actually also possible to integrate with the RSAT, and I'll show in the subsequent slides how that is working. It's an option to do that, not something you need to do. In the middle of this, obviously, you have the RSAT tool in which that you maintain and run your test suites from. And the RSAT tool is fully integrated with Azure DevOps, which enable that you have reporting capabilities and the power of DevOps for that. It is not a requirement. You can run the RSAT in a trial mode that does not require Azure DevOps to be available. And finally, you know, as you evolve in working with test automation, you may move into that you want to be running your test in an automated way. And this is where the Azure DevOps also can provide the options of building pipelines that execute RSATs in like a scheduled way or by triggers. So I have had the question mentioned before, what about my customizations? Are we able to test those? Yes, you are. The RSAT tool will be testing interactions on the UI. So any customizations that has been included in the application, like new fields that's been added, or maybe new forms even, you know, all of that is part of the user experience and can be recorded directly and played back as part of the RSAT. In fact, we have many of our ISVs that are using the RSAT tool as part of their testing for automated testing. In fact, even many of these are included in a release validation program that we run at Microsoft, where we have thousands of tests that are running as part of our early validation of releases before we push them out. So looking at this from a process point of view, really there are kind of four big areas that are working together here. We have, first of all, within the Dynamics test environment, where you initially will be making your task recordings, as mentioned. These recordings can be handed over and in use of the business process modeler within LCS, like if you're using that structure to help maintain your test libraries by. You can also skip that part potentially and include the test directly in RSAT, and you may start there just doing that. But there's these two paths you can take basically in taking your recordings into the RSAT tool. Having built up your suites of tests, then you will be able to run the tests, and the results of this can optionally be made available within DevOps. It depends on if you're running the trial mode of the RSAT, which will not be integrating to DevOps, or you can run the, in quote, normal mode that will be integrating to DevOps. This is similar, just a different type of view to the same, where you are looking at how things are connected. And the way that this is connecting is you have your recordings from your task recorder. You can put them into LCS that then will sync down to Azure DevOps, and so you'll have your recording and libraries created in that way, or you can instead put your recordings into RSAT directly. That would sync back to DevOps, but then obviously you wouldn't have it available in the within LCS within the BPM, aligning with the BPM model. So options you can go with in doing this. Both LCS and Azure DevOps are options. You can just make do with your test environment and a client machine where you install RSAT to. And by the way, a client machine can easily be just your end user's laptop where they install the application to. It's not a heavy application, so that is certainly a doable type of usage. So getting going and using RSAT, really it's about maintain your installation. You need to install RSAT. You need to be able to connect to your test environment, and we are using certificates to doing that. So those need to be installed, and there's some settings in RSAT that need to be done. But beyond that, then you are really ready to get going, creating your recordings in Task Recorder, recording and including them within the RSAT, either through the LCS or DevOps or directly into RSAT, and then running tests from within the RSAT application, which is where essentially then you would be executing a test process, reviewing your results and taking actions on that. And as I mentioned, DevOps is an option. You can certainly run the RSAT in trial mode without. And actually I'd recommend start out by using the trial mode. We name it trial mode, but don't get confused about that. For some companies, running RSAT in trial mode and don't ever needing Azure DevOps is fine, perfectly fine. There's no time limit or anything for using RSAT in trial mode. If that serves your purpose just well, stay with using RSAT in trial mode. That's just fine. It is an option adding DevOps, and so consider if that's right for you and make the call from that. More advanced use that you may move to eventually is that if you have Azure DevOps on, that you want to be making sure you run your test automation in a scheduled way by triggers, like having validation pipelines within Azure DevOps where you're running the test from. It may also be that if you have like development, they want to be triggering your validation as you're doing builds on that development, doing validations from that end. So I mentioned that we are needing to have certificates to connect to the test environment, and there are really two models by which these certificates can be created. Either you have a cloud-hosted environment that you're not able to remotely log into. Instead, certificates are then provided by LCS, and on the right-hand side, you see where you're maintaining your environment that you'll have two options for downloading certificates. There's also an option of renewing them. That needs to happen every 60 days, but you can control when you want to do that. When you're downloading certificates, you'll get a couple of files, and in the demo I'll do hereafter, you'll actually see those two files and how to interact with that. Another option is if you're running on a dev box or an on-premise type of solution where you can remotely connect to. In that scenario, you would actually have RSAT creating certificates, and then you would need to grant access to those certificates by connecting to the environments and then granting access in a so-called vif.config file. And there's a link on this slide providing further detail on how to do that. I'll take the first case where we have the certificate from LCS as part of the demo I'm doing. So Azure DevOps, should you be adding that? Well, something to consider there is that, well, it comes with a cost. There's a license cost in using DevOps. So be mindful of that is something to account for. But some of the benefits for sure is that if you have Azure DevOps, then basically it becomes a backend to all your RSAT users across different users. You'll have like a shared repository of tests that users all are working from. So like if one user is offering some tests, it can be synced up to Azure DevOps, and another user can then be running tests from that, syncing those down to their RSAT installation, running similar tests on their environment. And obviously it is a requirement also if you want to be using the BPM within the LCS that I mentioned before. But Azure DevOps is an option. You can stay with running the RSAT in trial mode without Azure DevOps. It basically means that RSAT is running using the local file system only. So files are not exchanged between different users. And so it's essentially kind of like a single user type of operation of RSATs, but that may work for some companies. So with that, I would want to move into a demo, and I have a VM ready for that. And you are able to see my my VM present, right? I hope so. So within this VM here, I've just opened a browser. I've been searching for download regression suite automation tool. This will give you a link directly to where the tool can be downloaded. It's from MS Download. And you see here we're currently on version 2.4 something. I can click download. I can select only the executables or even some release notes if I need that. For this case here, I'm only doing the executable and will be downloading that. And that just takes a few seconds. It is not a huge file that is downloading. So with that downloaded, I'm ready to go install the RSAT tool. And the installation process is fairly straightforward. I need to accept terms. I have options of installing the RSAT in different modes. Let's install both here. We also have the option of installing an application that can help you maintain your certificates on environments, specifically if you're using these like sandbox tier 2 cloud hosted environments. Then this app would allow for going through the steps of interacting with the LCS, obtaining certificates and applying them to environments without needing to do those manual steps. So it's a convenient way for interacting with this. So this is a new environment, so I imagine that I have been downloading the certificates from LCS. There are two files that are part of building the certificates. There is a general kind of authentication certificate that you trust the issuer, and then there's a personal certificate. Both needs to be installed. Installing is very seamless. You right-click install to local machine. I can optionally pick where I want this to go. This is the trusted root certificate. I believe it's selecting that automatically, but you know, rather safe than sorry. And the other one, similar local machine, and no entries there. And that goes to personal. And that's it. Now I have installed the certificates and I am ready to start the RSAT application. The certificates are those, just to repeat, that allow you for connecting with your F&O environment. Now I've cheated a little bit here because you will see that my settings are actually provided. They are coming from a credential manager for individual users, but these are informations that you should be able to obtain. One thing I'll call out is the thumbprint here is the certificate kind of DNA that exists. When you have installed certificates, you'll be able to do a drop down and then pick the certificate's thumbprint. So you'll obtain that from there. A couple of things on the settings here. On the environments that you're running against, you need to have a user specified that has system administrator type of access. This is required because the way we're connecting to the machine, we initially need to have full access, but then potentially in individual test, you can scale that down to run with a test user that only has limited access, as I mentioned before. The first paragraph here with settings for Azure DevOps, that will only be shown if you run the RSAT in this normal mode I'm at here. If running it in trial, that paragraph would not even exist and not needed to be provided. And obviously you're then mostly specifying the URL for your environments you connect towards. So right now I don't have anything, any tests in this particular suite here I have, but let's go and create one. So I have my test environment running here, and I want to be recording a scenario using the task recorder, creating purchase order. And so notice the recording tool has started now. From what I do from here on will, like clicking in the application, will be recorded by this. So clicking on the purchase order preparation, you see it actually reflecting that. Clicking a new purchase order. And now we come to some of the good practice when recording. It is preferable that you enter the values as opposed to as opposed to selecting. So, let's make sure we are completely clear and not making a mistake here. So rather than I have an issue later, I'll just restart that recording to be on the safe side. Apologies for that. So I'll offset again from the starting point. And entering the value directly, ensure that it's that particular value that is getting captured as part of the recording, and so also that the playback is going to be using that value and it's a repeatable and robust test. Some special features that are available in the task recorder is that on right-clicking a field like the purchase order, you see in this menu here that there's a task recorder section. I can do this option of copying a value. So here I'm copying the purchase order that ID that I'm just creating, and that may come in use later. So let me show you that a bit later on. We'll go about creating the purchase order. And I will enter a product. Let's have the unit price be 300. Let's provide 10% discount. So the total of the line would be 2,700. So something else you can do is, like, for instance, pull up the totals here. As part of this scenario, I might want to check that the total of the particular scenario result in that is the current value here. So basically I record a step where during playback it will confirm that the total of the order is indeed 2,700. And I can do additional steps on this. Any action here is something I can do. I'll just close this down. I'll stop the recording and save it locally. And that's really all I need to do here. So in the download folder, you'd see that it created a create PO, the name I gave it, and then an AXTR file. A little trick, you can change the suffix of the file into zip because it's actually a zip archive. And I'm able to then extract the content of this. And looking at what's in there, there's actually a recording file, an XML file, where all the steps that I did will be recorded. And this is the file that I'm looking at consuming within the RSAT. And I already had RSAT running, so no need to start it again. So in this suite here, I can, now I'm using the simple variant. I'm not going through LCS. I'm not using the BPN. I'm not adding the test to DevOps either. Now I'm just adding the test directly in RSAT. So creating the case here, adding then the recording file that I just had created and saving that. What this does is it takes the recording into RSAT. So RSAT is now aware of this particular test case here. It is only existing as a recording at this point. For RSAT to be able to run this, we need to kind of prime it. by creating like new additional files to be able to run the case. And clicking new here will do just that. It is processing a little bit of time. Basically, it goes through the recording file and assess all the steps there, and it will be then creating a set of files to be able to run the test afterwards. I clicked the directory up here. This allows me for seeing the local files that exist here. So you'd see we have the recording file, but then some additional files has been created as well. There's an Excel file that I'll show in a second, but there's also like some source code that RSAT created automatically and an executable file that RSAT will be using when running the test later. The Excel file is also accessible here by the parameters. And this is where you're able to set some settings that you want to have set for running the test. You can override like the legal entity that I shared earlier. You can specify like a test user. If you want to be running this as like a purchasing agent, like Alicia type of role, then you could specify a user that you have in your environment that match those security settings and then test that it's working under that context. In the test case steps, you see actually what I recorded earlier on, and notice how the purchase order was copied. So this means that the purchase order ID is available to reference later on. It's also shown here all those variables that are captured as part of this that I can use at a later point of time. And what I can do is basically I can, in Excel, I can copy paste this text here. And in another case that I would be building, then in the values here, instead of having a hard value like this, I could instead specify a variable name like this that would be used. Then what would happen is that as part of running the test, it would automatically substitute that variable name with the variable value, and in this way be able to pick up a context from an earlier case in the subsequent case. So this is kind of how you would be able to connect more cases together using variables to have that context established. Notice also we did a validate on the total. So this is available here. It's expecting to see the total of 2,700, and that is exactly equals that. You know, you can change to the quantity, the unit price, and basically create a new scenario directly here. Obviously, then you need to make the total that match that. So you have some interaction you can do with the test as part of this parameter file here. I didn't make any real changes, so I'm not safe here. So with that done, I'm basically able to run my test. And RSAT will then be basically orchestrating the F&O application, starting the test. It will first open a command prompt in which it will be doing some commands. The interaction will be actually utilizing Selenium in accessing the F&O environment. You'll see it automatically open here. This is not me clicking. This is RSAT doing the orchestration, running the application automatically here. And this will just take a couple of seconds to complete. And if everything goes well, then we would be looking at a passing test at the end of this. Let's see if we're fortunate. And notice here, as I said before, it is expanding like all the tabs and the way it's navigating to content here. It is making sure that those controls are visible. Now we couldn't see entry of the purchase order line. It's outside of the scroll bar, but it's going on there just out of screen sight. But RSAT will be able to interact with this no matter. And so hopefully we get a passing test. We did indeed. So This established obviously being able to go through these steps, but it also confirmed that the total was indeed how we expected this to be. So that was what I wanted to cover with the demo. So let me go back and sharing the presentation. So you might ask yourself, is RSAT the right tool for you? I hope I have you kind of convinced that test automation is critical. As part of running UAT on an ongoing basis, some kind of test automation will certainly pay dividends in terms of like the return of investments, not having to do manual test passes over and over again, and like some of the other benefits that I mentioned earlier on. RSAT is designed towards end users. You don't need to write code. You would hopefully kind of see and experience that it seems to be a good and doable tool for end users to use, as opposed to maybe some other tools that are more like code or script focused. We find that quite important, that we can have end users use the tool directly without having those type of requirements in the usage. You can automate tests within the finance and operation apps, the Commerce POS, warehouse mobile client. You can use the trial mode of RSAT. Then you don't need to consider Azure DevOps license costs. You're basically able to use this free. You can download the RSAT. You can start using it with your environment. There's no cost inferred from that. Later on, should you decide that Azure DevOps adds value for it, then you can kind of grow from there, adding DevOps. You might even consider using then the LCS BPM model as help guiding your process of defining tests. RSAT is not covering everything, unfortunately. RSAT is operating within the scope of these applications. It is not really in a space where integration testing is supported. It cannot support automating tests from third-party type of applications, and it doesn't support like other Dynamics applications either. So there's limitations there. That means also like applications like Power Apps or Power Automate is not supported. So this is where we are today, but we are considering how we want to evolve. I'm not clear exactly how that's going to land. We still have work to do there, but if you're impatient and you're needing something today, and that is the right choice for us, for you, then you can consider competitive solutions. There are other automation tools available that may then be a better fit for you. They typically come with a cost to be able to subscribe to such services, but that again may be right for you. Should you decide that RSAT is the right tool for you, then I'll just share a snippet on what is in the upcoming plans. We have plans that go actually quite a bit far out. We target to release approximately every like second month or something like that, I think on average. Some of the upcoming releases include that you, in particular with the trial mode, that you will have support for being able to export and import your test suite. So even though you're operating in your file system, you will be able to exchange your tests with others. It's also a handy tool for partners that are building tests on behalf of someone else, a customer, that makes for a vehicle for how to exchange those tests between. There will be support for the on-prem topology, the local business data. And then we will be looking into integration testing. Exactly how that's going to be supported is still a little bit open-ended, but we will be focusing on doing something to help enable that you can string together testing from your, say, third-party apps into FNO and maybe ending out in a third-party app as well. So that is on the roadmap as well. Supporting test variants is also something we would be looking at improving upon. And then we'll expand on building a more rich experience within DevOps and also some user experience improvement in the task recorder. We are considering actually changing the way that we are connecting to the F&O environment to make that user-based instead of by certificates. So that is one thing that we also are considering as well. So I cannot cover this in full detail, obviously. There's much to cover here. So here's a page with some further resources that you can go inspect. I will encourage that you join the Insider program, that you participate in the community we have. There is more than 2,500 people that are in the community, and we have a quite vibrant community there, exchanging like idea, getting others' perspectives on something. And we even kind of allow for that if you have issues, you can report them there. I'm usually attempting to be quite responsive on that one as well, redirecting with like if there's workarounds or if there's an actual issue we need to have reported, then directing towards service requests to be logged if and when that is needed. If you are finding it hard to get going with this and really need some kind of support, like someone to partner with, then on AppSort, there's actually a couple of partners that are providing consultancy services to get you going on RSAT. So that's an option you can pull upon. Also, obviously, it comes with the costs. So there's a link to that here as well. So wrapping up, a call to action here. I hope that you are now really curious about going on board with test automation and that you are up for trying RSAT out. So I encourage you, go download, install this today, try make your first recordings, do playback, become familiar with how hopefully you will experience this to be quite easy to get going with. So gain experience from that. And with that, I'll just say welcome to the journey of using test automation. I hope it will be a fun and inspiring one for you. With that, I will be turning to questions. So any questions at this point? You know how we are on timing.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, there's been some great discussion and dialogue in the chat on people exchanging ideas about test automation. I think there's a question by Vijesh who's just asked you, hi Frank, can you share the link? So the links that you had on that PowerPoint slide with all the RSAT links, is that something you could share in the chat, Frank?
So I asked actually for one of you hosting the summit here, how we might be able to exchange the presentations here. Might it be okay that I actually upload my presentation in the chat here in a moment? Because
sure,
in that
definitely,
case,
yes. Please feel free to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's probably a convenient. Then you could also reiterate some of the content here if you want to. Yeah. So let me do that in just a sec here. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So Ina and many of the people on here have been really exchanging information. There's a question by Zoo who is asking, we import parameter and try to test at least parameter group data into setup, right? RSAT if has stand test task recorder template then can help. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sense out of that question. Zeng, if you could just Jun Zeng has asked the question, is LCS giving RSAT template case for standard test? Is that okay, Frank? That question. So basically I think what Jun Zeng is asking is that does LCS provide templates for standard tests for RSAT?
We do not provide template tests. We have been a bit torn on that one. The challenge here is that ideally you'd look for testing what is important to you and what's unique to you. And if you provide like template tests, you might be inclined in just running them. And then everyone would be running the same test and not really adding a whole lot of value then in that case. So making test your own, I think, is a quite key thing on getting on board with testing here. So assessing what is the important thing for you, what is the data you want to be running on, how are your configuration of your application set up, and then aligning your scenarios to that. This is very easily going to be something where you are looking to make them your own. I mean, I wouldn't mind sharing a couple of standard recordings that can be run without doing task recordings, but hopefully, as you saw, just tracing a few steps using the task recording and taking the file and incorporating within the RSAT is really not that difficult. So maybe the value is a bit marginal, really, by end of the day. At least that's been our thinking. And holders.
Thank you, Frank. So Ines asked quite a popular question, which is how long does it generally take to automate 200 to 400 tests for a customer for automated regression testing? In my experience, 4 to 6 months with a good test manager on a customer site with 2 to 5 testers. Do these numbers sound correct or similar?
I mean, I think a lot is riding upon what prior experience are you coming with. If the discipline is new to you, then you'll go through some time where you're becoming familiar with what's my strategy here? How do I take inventory of the different scenarios? How do I break it down? How do I figure out what is my P1s, P2s, and P3s? What are the scenarios to go record? Then figuring out what's the data I want to be using. Sure, end to end, all of that will take some time doing. I would ask the question, in a manual test pass situation, this is work you ideally should be doing no matter what, to be having a good and repeatable and reliable testing strategy. It does take effort. It does take focus as well, I would say. So accounting for that testing is something you need to consider as a kind of like a discipline, I think is a good thing. The time that needs to go into this and recording that number of tests, hard to say. It will take some time. I'm not sure it needs to take as long time as that. I know that some of these partners we have that can help provide, like a service providers, getting you going on doing some tests. They have a service that's running over a few weeks where they're actually targeting recording a good set of tests to get you going from. And I think that in itself would help accelerate also some of the learning that is happening. But yeah, no, don't discard that it will take some time. I'm not sure if it's like that amount of time or not, but I'll say one more thing is that start light again and build over time. Don't necessarily think you need to go automate 200 or 400 tests from the start. Maybe it's a good idea initially automating just a subset, relying somewhat on still doing manual testing, gain experience, find those best practices, apply them, and then as you mature with that, expand from there. I'll say also, I've seen companies that start out by automating a whole lot of tests, and then over time, as they have taken multiple updates to the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations apps, they come to reassess the risks. And by end of the day, maintaining a test automation suite, it has a cost associated. If you build your test to be robust, they are not failing often, but it can happen from time to time that you need to go re-record a test for whatever reason, and there's some effort involved in that. So obviously, with the number of tests you maintain, that adds up a bit of cost with that. I've seen some companies that after like half a year, where they have seen, okay, where are my risks? And then maybe adjusting their safety net and saying, okay, I don't need to test all that much. I can scale down a little bit because I don't think that there's that much of a distinct risk in certain areas. And so from that, they have gone down and reduced the number of tests that they maintain after some months. So, allow also for that kind of learning to happen.
Thank you, Frank. And the final question is by Ratchet, who's asking, with the platform convergence, a key focus for Microsoft, are there any plans to converge regression testing tools across the multiple Dynamics applications?
It's an excellent question. One that I cannot say with much certainty right now, but you're right on cue there. I met up just this week with other people from within the Power Platform that are working on test automation tools. To those of you that might be familiar, we have a couple of test automation tools that are used within the Power Platform and made available also by Microsoft. They're not running on the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations, but focusing on the Power Platform applications. And we are assessing together. We have been teaming up and are teaming up, discussing how do we see some kind of a converging strategy around that. How that's going to manifest, too early to say at this point in time, but it's something we are aware of. I would like to see by end of the day that we have one common recording experience that can be used across the board, so that it's only one type of experience that end users need to familiarize themselves with, and also like the execution of the test is running in a common type of form. So let's see if we get there. It's getting discussed at this point. So
thank you so much, Frank. Really appreciate you joining today. It was a very topical issue that you've addressed. So thank you so much. So everyone, Frank will be uploading his files. We will be uploading it to the chat shortly, and you know how to reach out to him. So thank you once again, Frank, for joining us today.
Again, my pleasure. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. That was Frank Dahl. So excellent.